7 months after Denton was released, the mother of a 15-year-old convent schoolgirl called the local police to say that her daughter had been raped. The girl described how she and 3 friends had got to know a man they sometimes saw on their way home from school. That day they had skipped school and gone round to his flat. He had behaved in such a crazy way that they'd called him Screw Loose. They drank some wine and smoked a joint, and she had fallen asleep. Her friends had left, and she'd woken up to find the man forcing himself upon her. His name was Delroy Denton. Denton was arrested and remanded in custody, though he denied the rape, saying the girl had consented. The girl herself was admitted to hospital on the day after the rape, having taken an overdose of sleeping pills. 2 months later, the Crown Prosecution Service dropped the charges against Denton on the grounds of insufficient evidence. But still time, perhaps, to revisit Fotheringham's original view of Denton as very dangerous. We've discovered that 5 months earlier, the Jamaican's asylum application had been refused. For Delroy Denton, deportation could not be far away. But then, an unfortunate thing happened. Denton's immigration file had been marked for dispatch to Fotheringham for a final round of inquiries, and it had disappeared. Denton was back on the streets of London. By April 1995, deportation was on no one's agenda. Denton was still reporting to Fotheringham's office and still working for Scotland Yard. And 24-year-old Marcia Laws, the mother of 2 small children, went missing.
I was sort of preparing myself for something. I sort of, you know, shipped my little boy off to a friend's house for the weekend, phoned up another friend to say, look, this something's happened to Marcia. Whatever happens, we're going to phone the police or kick the door down, because the house was just dark all the time. No one's seen her, type of thing. And then just getting into the house, seeing her there, you know, I did scream a little bit, and then sort of just stopped, waited for. I remember wanting the ambulance to hurry up, even knowing that she was dead. I just wanted them to hurry up to take her out of there. It was horrible that she's been there for, you know, God knows how many days.
Denton was arrested and charged, but after 4 months in custody, the Crown Prosecution Service decided there was insufficient evidence to gain a conviction. They dropped the case. It was a decision that incensed the local murder squad. They knew Denton was an illegal immigrant and that his claim to asylum had been refused at the Home Office. So they asked Brian Fotheringham to detain him. Fotheringham refused. Denton was released onto the street again, and Fotheringham and Scotland Yard continued to use him as an informant. The murder squad investigating Marcia's murder knew Denton was their man, and they reactivated the case. They found more evidence, rearrested Denton, and charged him again with the murder of Marcia Laws. In July last year, Delroy Denton was jailed for life. Fotheringham has been questioned by his bosses about the decision to release Denton and how the Immigration Service could have failed to serve the papers that could have saved 2 women from his violence. Fotheringham insisted the file had been lost. We spoke to David Burrell, former inspector with the Immigration Service's Law Enforcement Unit, about the legal position.
Mr. Burrell, once an asylum application letter has been written and an application rejected, how common would it be for that letter to sit around at immigration for a period of months?
Most uncommon, almost unheard of, I would say.
So how concerned would you have been at such a failure, such a delay?
Extremely concerned, because once received, the immigration officers is under a duty to make arrangements for that person's removal from the country.
Brian Fotheringham denies that he has ever helped a Yardi informer to stay illegally in the UK. But a man who has worked closely with him has told us that such arrangements can be made.
There was an unwritten policy of cooperation between the police and the immigration service. That's the kind of understanding you get when people work closely together. We relied on the police for our existence. We want the police to make our arrests. We want police cells to hold people in custody. We need police interview rooms. In return, there are certain things that go on. Well, one way of helping the police was you could ignore a situation. You could sit on a file and turn a blind eye. Agreements were made that a file would remain halfway down the pipeline. It was all based on trust.
I have no doubt that from time to time arrangements are made unofficially to allow his detention by the Immigration Service to be delayed for a little while. And speaking pragmatically, and as an ex-police officer rather than as an current one, I see nothing wrong with that idea, provided it's carried out in a responsible way.
There have been wider problems with Scotland Yard's Yardie operation. 3 times in 4 years, separate squads were set up, and 3 times in 4 years, the squads were shut down before they could finish the job. One Jamaican killer was imported into the UK, given a luxury flat and car, and entertained by officers at the local golf range. The cost? About £30,000. The return? According to a senior source, not a single arrest. Another Yardie informant came in on a 6-month visa and stayed for 10 years. He was eventually jailed for armed robbery. And then there was the case of Eton Green. Green was Constable Barker's other star informant. In 1993, while working for Scotland Yard, Green was arrested by the Nottingham police for leading a massive robbery on a blues party held in this warehouse on the outskirts of the city. For a time, Peter Coles was in charge of the investigation.
During the early hours, a gang of men came in. They announced that they was, believe it was the Seek and Destroy posse, fired some shots and in fact shot one man in the leg, and proceeded to rob most of the people present of money, watches, rings, etc. And a huge number of people actually got robbed at gunpoint and were terrified by it.
At the warehouse robbery trial, Green turned Queen's evidence and helped convict his Yardie accomplices. Green was eventually sentenced to 6 years in prison. But in court it emerged that when Nottingham officers had begun investigating Green, Scotland Yard had impeded them. Scotland Yard had failed to pass on to Nottingham information which would have been helpful in their investigation. And at a time when Nottingham detectives had asked for Scotland Yard's help in arresting Green, Steve Barker, his handler, had met with Green and allowed him to walk away. And then, in violation of Home Office rules, Scotland Yard's officers had misled the court about Green's role as an informant. In his summing up, Mr. Justice Smedley reserved his harshest words for Scotland Yard.
I am very disturbed at the way in which those responsible for handling Mr. Green appear not only to have failed to cooperate, but possibly to have impeded Nottingham's inquiries.
I think the general feeling left was that they had been obstructed in a way that they didn't expect fellow police officers to obstruct them. I think the officers that were actually hands-on by the time of the trial would agree with that sentiment.
The story gets stranger. Shortly after his conviction, Green was taken out of prison to a Metropolitan Police safe house. There, he agreed to become a supergrass. He made a detailed confession of his life of crime. In the process, Green admitted to committing 11 murders in Jamaica. He also described a series of violent crimes carried out in London while he was being paid as an informer. The way that Green's extraordinary confession has been handled raises serious questions about Scotland Yard's anti-Yardie operation. To start with, Scotland Yard have never told the Jamaican police. Nor has Green been prosecuted for the violent crimes he admitted in London. In the debriefing, quite deliberately, he was never cautioned because they feared he'd clam up. His admissions could not be used against him. Scotland Yard simply kept the confessions of a multiple killer and armed robber to themselves.
It is very, very surprising to me as a police officer because it is a fundamental rule of policing. It's not something that, you know, it's not a clever rule. It's one of the very, very first things that you are taught, that a person who is suspected of committing an offence, or indeed in this case is admitting an offence, has to be cautioned. It's just not something, it is second nature to any policeman.
If he suddenly comes out with stuff they don't expect, particularly about serious crime like that, well, you know, you've just got no option. You may not want to do it because it might stop him talking, but you have to do it.
Despite Green's confessions to murder and random violence, Scotland Yard now set about easing his way back onto the streets of London. They sent a report to the parole board outlining his value as an informant, and they approached the Home Office to try to stop him being deported. But would he carry on robbing and shooting as he had done in his previous career as an informer? There seemed no way of knowing, although a parole assessment report suggested Green should take part in anger management sessions after his release. Nobody knows how many Yardies have been allowed into the country by Scotland Yard, nor how many crimes they have gone on to commit.
It's clear that rules have been broken and laws have been bent in an operation whose senior management appears to have been in a state of some confusion. Neither Scotland Yard nor the Immigration Department are willing to discuss what they've done. The victims have been left alone, without any explanation, trying to come to terms with what's happened to them.